If you're outputting logs in a Python application using the standard library, by default those logs are going to be in plain text format. And this is an unstructured format where the data is essentially just text, and it can be quite difficult to extract particular pieces of information from that text and then analyze that and group by some of that information. In this video we're going to look at an alternative, and this is using a package called python-json-logger, and this package provides a formatter that allows you to easily convert your log outputs to JSON format. And that's a structured format that allows you to look at different keys and values and then analyze that data in a central location, for example on BetterStack. So we're going to create these JSON logs in a FastAPI application. If you're enjoying this content, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the BetterStack channel for more. And let's dive in. So the package that we're going to look at soon is this one here. It's called python-json-logger. As you can see, it's got 1,600 stars on GitHub, and it provides a JSON formatter for the standard Python logger. And if we scroll down, we can see how that's used. If we go to the usage section, what we do is we import the JSON logger, and we can use the JSON formatter object in that module to create a formatter that we can then add to a handler using the setFormatter method. We'll see some examples of that later in the video. What we're going to do now is go to VS Code, where we have a starter project open, and we're going to very quickly run through the code here. We have a list of hard-coded bands, and there's 4 of these in the list, and each band has an ID, a name, and a genre. And at the top we're importing a logger object, and then we're calling the logger.info method and passing a message of hello. So let's take a very quick look at the logger.py file. We import the Python logging module, and we're creating a logger object on line 3, and then we set up a file handler, and we're telling the logger to output the logs to a file called app.log. So that's the handler, and then we call the setFormatter method on that handler, and we pass to that an instance of Python's logging.formatter, and that takes a format string, and you can see some of the parameters being passed in here, such as the current time at which the log entry was generated, the log level name, and that can be info, warning, error, and so on, and we also have the log message itself. And finally we add that handler to the logger object, and we set the default level to logging.info, and that means if we have any log events at the level of info, or at a level that's more severe than info, then these will be output to the handlers configured on this logger. Now what we're going to do in API.py is build a small API in this video to return a list of bands, and also to return a band by its ID, and we're going to add some logging and convert that standard text format to JSON in this Python application. Now to start with, let's create a Python virtual environment, and I'm using Python version 3.11 in this video, but these concepts should work with other versions as well. So let's use the venv module, and we're going to create a virtual environment, and let's just call it venv demo. And you can see that that's processing just now. When that's completed, we're going to be able to activate a script in this directory here. It's called the activate script. So let's run that piece of code now. We'll go to the venv directory, and within that, if you're on Windows, it's the scripts directory. On a Mac or Linux, it's going to be in the bin directory. And within that, we have a script called activate. So that's activated the Python virtual environment. Now we're going to use FastAPI in order to create this API. So what we're going to do is go to the documentation, and there'll be a link to this below the video. If you need to install FastAPI, you can copy this command here and go back to our terminal, and we're going to paste that in now that we're in this virtual environment. Now this particular command with all in square brackets, what that's going to do is also install 𝗵𝗽𝗀, which can be used as the server that runs the application. So let's go back to VS Code, and we now have FastAPI and 𝗵𝗽𝗀 installed. Let's start by removing this logger.info call, and we're going to create a FastAPI application. So from FastAPI at the top, we need to import the FastAPI object. So let's copy that, and we're going to create a variable called app by instantiating the FastAPI object. Now I'm also going to bring in another import from FastAPI at the top, and that's the request object. And this request object allows you to access things on the request, such as the method, and also any data that was sent in the request, such as JSON data coming from a client. And then just below here, we can create the function. So we're going to use the app.get function, and this endpoint is going to return a list of bands. So let's give it the URL /bands, and that's going to be accessible via a GET request. And then we can define the function, and it's going to be called bands, and we're going to pass the request into this so that we can access those properties on the request object. Now let's use this logger that we've imported at the top within the body of this handler function. We're going to use the logger.info method, and I'm going to use an f string here to output a message that contains some details from the request. So let's just pass a very simple message for now, request received at, and then we're going to use the f string syntax here to reference a value, and that's going to be a property on the request object, the URL property. So we're going to log this to the handler, request received at the given URL, and then we can return the list of bands that we have above here that are hard-coded from this endpoint. FastAPI will convert that from a Python dictionary to JSON data that's sent over the wire to the client, and then we can run this at the bottom using 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀. So the command's going to be 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀, and then the name of the file that we have here is API, and then we use the colon in this command, and then we can specify the name of the FastAPI object, and we called that app on line 11, so we're referencing that here. And we're going to also pass the -- reload flag here so that the server will reload whenever anything changes in the code base. Now if we go to the browser at localhost 8000/bands, let's do that now, what we get back is some JSON data that represents the bands that we have in that hard-coded list. Now we want to check what's been output using this logger.info method, so let's go to the app.log file. This is the file that was configured using the Python file handler object and added to that logger. We can see we get the timestamp, we also get the log level of info, and finally we get the message request received at and then the name of the URL, and that's coming directly from this property here. Now let's say that we wanted to enrich these logs with more information. Let's go back to api.py, and within the handler function, let's define a dictionary that we're going to call data, and that's going to contain some different keys and values. Let's add the IP address to this. We can access that from the request.client.host property. So the FastAPI request object has another object called client, and we can access the host on that. And that's going to give us back the IP address. And let's say we also wanted the request method. We can get that directly from the request, and that's using the method property. And finally, I'm going to add a status code to this dictionary, and that's going to be for the response status. And we're going to hard code that response status as the response code 200. Now we want to pass this data into our logger.info call here, and there's a keyword argument we can use in Python to do this, and we're going to explain this in a minute, but let's just pass it in now. It's the extra keyword argument. We're going to set that to a dictionary of data, and in our case we have one here and it's called data. Now let's go to the Python documentation on these logger methods, and here's one here. It's the debug method. This takes the message and it also takes optional arguments and keyword arguments. Now each logger method in Python will inspect 4 keyword arguments, and one of these is the extra keyword argument. You can see that's been wrapped here, and if we scroll down a bit further here we can get a description of this extra keyword argument. So extra can be used to pass a dictionary, which is used to populate the dictionary of the log record that's created for the logging event with the user-defined attributes. And these custom attributes can be used as you like. For example, they can be incorporated into logged messages. And you can see that below we have a format string that contains the time, but it also contains custom directives here, such as the client IP and also the user. Now these are not standard log record attributes, but you can use your own attributes here if you pass in an extra dictionary that contains keys for these attributes. And you can see that here a dictionary is defined with a client IP and a user key, and then the logger.warning method is used, and that dictionary D is passed in with the extra keyword argument, and that's going to format the message with those extra keyword arguments that are passed in via this parameter. Now let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to go back to this endpoint, and we can see that we're passing the extra information in here from this dictionary above. So what effect is that going to have? Let's go back to the browser and refresh this endpoint, and then we can go back to VS Code and look at the app.log file. And you can see that the log message is the same as it was before. Now the reason for that, even though we have this extra data being passed in, if we go back to logger.py, the formatter that's being used here is not referencing those new keys. So we would need to add those keys to this formatter. Let's do that now, and I'm going to do this on a new line so that we can see the different attributes that we're passing to the formatter. Now if we go back to api.py, we have 3 new keys in this dictionary: IP address, method, and status code. So let's reference these in the formatter here. So after the message, I'm just going to add the extra attributes. And we have one for the IP address, one for the method, and one for the status code. Now when we go back to the API and refresh the page, if we go back to VS Code again and look at the log file, we can see the extra information has appeared in this file. We have the IP address, which is localhost in this case, as well as the HTTP method, which was a GET request. And we also have the status code of 200. Now the goal of this video is to take this text format that we have here and output this as JSON data in keys and values. And that's where we're going to use that python-json-logger package. So let's stop the server that we're running here and go back to the GitHub page for that package. And we're going to scroll up and get the pip install command. And here it is here. We're going to copy that and go back to the terminal and run that here to install that in the Python virtual environment. Now once that's been installed, we can go back to api.py and we're going to go to the top and we're going to import from that package python-json-logger, and from that we'll import a module called JSON-logger. Now that's the import that we need, but we actually need this in the logger.py file, so let's cut it out of here and go back to logger.py. We're going to import that at the top, and we're going to change this line of code here where we're using the setFormatter method, and instead of logging.formatter, we're going to use that JSON-logger module, and we're going to use the JSON formatter in that module. And that's actually the only change we're going to need here. Let's go back to the terminal and we're going to run the server now. And if we go back to the browser and refresh this page, and let's go back to VS Code and look at the file that's generated, you can see now that the generated data in this file is in JSON format. So we have a key for the time as well as the level name and the message. And if we go to the right hand side here, the custom keys and values that were passed in using the extra keyword argument, they are also here. So we get the IP address, the HTTP method, and the status code. So it's very simple in your Python applications. If you want to use JSON formatted logs, you can simply install this python-json-logger package and then use the JSON formatter within that in order to output the logs in JSON format. And this JSON formatter will work with any type of handler in Python. So for example, if we use the stream handler and we can get rid of the file name keyword argument here. If we now go back to the browser and refresh this API and go back to this page, you can see at the bottom that the logs are now appearing in standard output because of the stream handler, and they're appearing here in JSON format. Let's now move on. We're going to show how to send these logs to BetterStack, and the goal here is that when a request comes into our handler function here, as well as outputting the logs to a file, we're also going to send the logs over the wire to BetterStack where they can be centralized and analyzed effectively. So we're going to ship those logs to BetterStack directly from our application code, and there are other ways we might want to do this, for example using a tool like Vector or FluentD, and we did videos on those recently, so you can check those out in the description. What we're going to do is go to BetterStack and create what's called a source, and that's a place where we can ship the logs to on BetterStack. So we're on the BetterStack platform now, and at the top right what we're going to do is connect a source, and we're going to call this, let's just call it JSON demo. Now the platform for this is going to be Python, so let's select that and then we can create the source. Now once the source is created, we can get this source token that we have here. So we're going to reference that in a second, but in order to send our logs directly from our application to BetterStack, we're going to need to install a package to allow us to do that. Now this page will be linked below the video, and we're going to skip the section on logging in Django and go directly to the logging from Python section. And there's a package we can install called logtail-python. So let's copy that and go back to the terminal, and we're going to stop the 𝗵𝗽𝗀 server, and we can paste that pip install command in to install the logtail-python package that's going to allow us to send those logs to BetterStack. Now once that's installed, we're going to go back to the documentation and we're going to set this Python logger up with BetterStack. So we have a logger object, and what we're going to do is create a new handler that's going to be an instance of the logtail handler. So let's copy the import to start with, and we're going to go back to VS Code and go to the logger.py file. At the top, from logtail, we can import that logtail handler. And then let's go back to the documentation, and we're going to copy this instantiation of the logtail handler, and we're going to do that here in the application code. Now we already have a handler here, and that's for outputting the logs to a file. We're going to create another one just below that, and I'm going to paste that line of code in, and we're going to change the name of the variable to BetterStack handler. Now there's a couple of things we need to do here. We need to pass the source token into the logtail handler. And remember that when we created the source in BetterStack, if we go back to the platform now, we can copy this source token that we got back, and we're going to use that directly in this parameter here for the logtail handler. So let's paste that in here. And of course in the real application, this token should not be embedded in plain text within your application code. It can be read from an environment file or some kind of secret management tool. So that's created a BetterStack handler object, and we now need to add this new handler to the logger. Now we already have a call here for the file handler. I'm going to copy that down to the line below, and we're going to also add the BetterStack handler to the logger object. And that should be all we need to do in order to get these logs shipped to BetterStack from our Python application. So let's clear the terminal, and I'm going to rerun the 𝗵𝗽𝗀 server. And if we go back to the page here and refresh the API that we have and go back to the terminal, we can still see that we have the output from the stream handler here. But if we go back to the browser and go to our BetterStack platform, within this source we can click live tail, and we're going to see the live tail that contains all of the logs that are being shipped to this particular source. So let's have a look at the data that's being sent, and you can see we have the file name, the IP address, the level, the message, and so on. So this is useful information about the log event. We can see the message, for example, that the request was received at that particular URL, but we also get the method and the status code, and also the IP address that were specified in that extra dictionary that was passed into logger.info. So let's go back to api.py and have a quick look at that. We were passing that in here with the extra keyword argument, and BetterStack automatically knows how to parse that data when it's sent via the logtail handler, and that data is then extracted as keys and values on the platform. And that's useful because we can then search over those keys and values, as we're about to see in a minute. So let's go back to logger.py. Our BetterStack handler here is using the logtail handler, which automatically extracts those keys and values from the extra dictionary. And for our stream handler, which used to be the file handler, we also get the logs output in JSON format because we're using that JSON formatter object. Now let's finish the video by quickly writing one more endpoint in this FastAPI application. We're going to use app.get again as a decorator, and this time we're going to search for a band by its ID. So let's look at this list of bands. Every band has an ID, and you can imagine in a real application that that would be coming from a database. What we're going to do in the handler function here is allow an ID to be passed in the URL as a path parameter. So let's give this URL the path of /bands, and then we're going to reference that dynamic ID. And then we can write the function, and let's just call it getBand. And that's going to accept that ID that was passed in as the path parameter. Now we're going to search through this list of bands here for the band with an ID that matches what's in the URL. So let's paste a line of code in here. We're going to use Python's next function, and within that we have an expression that's looping over each band in that list of bands, and for each band it encounters in that list, it's going to check if that band's ID matches the ID that's coming in as a parameter, and if that's the case it will return that into the variable called band. And if it gets to the end of that list and has not returned an object, it's going to use the default value, which is the second parameter to the next function, and in this case we've specified that that should be none. And once that expression is complete, we can check the value of the band. So first of all, let's check if it's equal to the none value, and if we don't find a band, we're going to use the logger.info method, and we're going to pass an f string to that, no band found with the ID, and then we'll pass in the value from the URL, and we're going to pass an extra dictionary again here, and I'm going to define this in line. Let's add a status code here of 404 because we've not found a band with that ID. And after we've logged that information, we're going to return an HTTP exception from FastAPI. So let's import that at the top. After the request object, we'll also import HTTP exception, and then we're going to return that with a status code of 404. And we can give this a message as well, and we're just going to say no band found. So the function execution will end here if no band has been found. Otherwise, if we get to the block below here, I'm going to copy this logger.info statement and we're going to paste it in here. And let's just say that a band was found with the given ID, and we can change the status code to 200. And the final step in this function is to return some data. So we're going to return the band that was found at the end of this block. So let's now test this out. If we go back to the browser, you can see the IDs of these bands. I'm going to search for the band with ID of 2 in this URL. So let's do that now. And we get back that particular band with the ID of 2. Now if we go back to the URL and we search for something that doesn't exist, for example that ID there, we're now getting back a different response with the status code 404 and the detail of no band found, which matches what we passed into the HTTP exception. Now the interesting thing here is that if we go back to BetterStack, we should now see these different messages from the logger.info calls. So let's go back to the live tail now, and we're going to inspect these messages. So let's start at the top here, no band found with the given ID. If we expand that, we can see some of the information here, and the one I want to focus on is the status code. If we look back to the code that was passed in using the extra keyword argument, and the logtail handler automatically picks that out, and you can see that here, and it's set to 404. If we go to one of the other messages, we can see that we get a status code of 200 when the band with the ID in the URL does exist in the data. Now what we can do on BetterStack once we have our logs in this central location is we can search through them very efficiently. So let's go to this search bar at the top, and we're going to look for the status code here, and we're going to try and find some log entries that have a particular status code. So you can imagine that you might want to find all requests that had a status of 404 in the response. We can do that search here, so status code equals 404. If we do that search on this live tail, we get back only the items that have the status code of 404. And this can be changed up, so for example, if we wanted to find all responses that were not equal to a 200 status code, we can also do that search here and we get back, in this case, the 2 log entries that have a 404. And this can be easily changed to equals at the top if we want to get back the requests that did have a response code of 200. So it's very easy to start searching and filtering the logs once you have them in BetterStack. And if you want to get more advanced, you can also create dashboards to analyze the log data that you're receiving. And you can also create alerts if something happens that you want to be alerted about based on this log data. So that's all for this video. In this video, we've shown how to use the python-json-logger tool to convert your plain text Python logs into a structured JSON format when you're outputting those to standard output or standard error or to a file. And we also saw how we can use BetterStack's log tail handler in order to pass the logs from our application code to BetterStack for analysis, and also how any keys that are passed in with the extra keyword argument to Python's logger methods, these will be automatically picked out of that dictionary and will then be available as keys that you can search on using the BetterStack platform. So thanks for watching, give the video a thumbs up if you're enjoying this content and subscribe to the channel for more, and we'll see you in the next video.